David Carradine, who played the titular Bill in Kill Bill, kept a dated diary of his experience making the movie, which was then published in 2006 as this book. I like that it was released a couple of years after both movies because it means, one, it probably wasn't rushed just for the sake of maximum marketing, and related, two, it means that the book covers the entire process from his first meeting with Quentin Tarantino to after the premiere and press for Volume 2. This approach of using a diary format may be the best, most powerful way to chronicle the making of a movie and as a way to offer insight into the process, yet it is so rarely used that it almost doesn't exist. And so while it was very exciting to see that being used here, sadly, although the idea is amazing and the book does explore and benefit from it, the overall execution is so clueless that it leaves a lot to be desired. But let's start with the positives, because despite any of the unappealing aspects, like I just said, this kind of approach for a behind-the-scenes book is so rare that the book benefits greatly from the novelty and unique perspective it offers and the advantage of this format that you don't get with most making of books. Now, having said that, I am going to be frequently comparing this to most normal making of books, just for the sake of having a standard point of reference. But the most important thing to understand straight up about this book is that it is not the complete making of Kill Bill. This is David Carradine's experience making Kill Bill. So there is nothing, or very little, about the making of the movie outside of his purview. And the big limitation of that for fans who do want to find out as much as they can about the movie itself is that Bill doesn't really have much screen time, and the scenes he is in are mostly just talking. So you have to keep in mind that there is precious little of the movie's making that he was actually there to witness. Which I don't think is a bad thing in theory, as I'd rather have a satisfying and narrow view of something specific rather than the dissatisfying, broad and shallow overview most books suffer from trying to cover everything. Unfortunately, this book doesn't quite live up to that and instead mostly ends up being narrow and shallow. So for example, he talks at great length about all the physical training during pre-production, but nothing about any of his preparation as an actor, finding the character, stuff like that, which honestly I was kinda glad because I couldn't care less about that sort of thing, but it does seem like a telling oversight of how something can fall within his experience and still not be explored. Likewise, other things might be brought up but then never explained. For example, he'll talk about Quentin being in the gym with him and training for Pai Mei and how good he is, but then later will just mention that a new actor was now cast in the role and doesn't offer any explanation as to why. So the behind-the-scenes hows and whys are only rarely present when a byproduct of the main focus of him telling his personal experience and thoughts. But it does leverage some of the advantages of the diary format to good effect. Because it's told chronologically, there's a sense of story to engage with, a natural unfolding timeline of the process that you just don't get with making of books that are organized by subject. Similarly, where most making of books are written from the perspective of a bird's-eye third party who got the information second-hand, this book's at its best when it puts you in the trenches, on the set. Each entry basically mentions the main event or events of the day, and then the best ones will recount usually like a single specific anecdote from that day. Those parts are usually told in present tense, which also contributes to that feeling of being in the room, and then adding even further to this great sense of reality is just how open and honest the book is. You know, this isn't some sycophant journalist or PR monkey trying to create the most flattering, inoffensive puff piece about the production and the parties involved. Carradine doesn't shy away from presenting conflict, nor is he concerned with presenting any sort of perfect movie-making magic facade, but he's not doing it for the sake of trying to play up being a scandalous tell-all. Don't think based on what I've just said that this is about spilling juicy Hollywood gossip. He's done it simply as a matter of presenting the raw reality of filmmaking, and this is really the only thing that David Carradine does as a writer that I actually appreciate. Because as for the actual content he's writing in each entry, and therefore the book as a whole, that's where it starts to run into some problems. So in terms of its behind-the-scenes content, this book is focused on the banalities of filmmaking, specifically as it pertains to being an actor. So I think most people will find this book pretty boring because of that. However, it goes hand in hand with that reality of filmmaking that I just mentioned. Most of it's not as exciting as portrayed in behind-the-scenes highlight reels we're usually exposed to. When that Hollywood mystique is stripped away, it's funny how workaday and thrown together a lot of it is. I, for one, actually enjoyed quite a bit of this because of the insight it offers that you just don't get from other filmmaking books. Not just on the set, but also the industry and filmmaking adjacent aspects that are part of the realities of being involved in making a movie, or just those things that are part of the human reality of making a movie. movie. Schedule changes and call times, agents, transportations, things that are perhaps technically uninteresting, but I was interested and enjoying it nonetheless due to its rare perspective and presentation of the process. I also particularly love the decision to include a couple of emails and letters which contribute some text type variety as well as to that insider authenticity. So while I did enjoy a lot of that, unfortunately he pushes this focus on the shallow, trivial and personal aspects way too far. And sadly, that ends up defining the book. That sense of authenticity I mentioned is something of a two-edged sword. One that ends up being particularly hazardous when in the hands of someone like David Carradine, who just does not have any understanding of how to wield it. His on-set entries are predominantly descriptions of what they were shooting and describing what the sets look like and what people were wearing, and then he'll recount a conversation with someone about something that has nothing to do with the movie. There is a lot of stuff in this book that is not only unrelated to the movie, but just inane garbage in its own right. Like when he talks about going to parties or dinners with people on the movie, that's not always very interesting, but I can enjoy a bit of that in terms of how it presents that human reality. But that becomes difficult when shallow and unrelated content becomes the defining feature of the book at the expense of anything actually interesting or important. There's one part in the middle where for 20 straight pages he doesn't talk about anything to do with the movie. It's him recounting just puttering around LA doing career administration and publicity stuff that has nothing to do with the movie. You know, like I said, I did enjoy the focus on the banality of that stuff when it's giving that sort of day-in-the-life quality to the making of the movie, but once it's no longer about the movie and he's spending 5 pages telling you about a dream he had or going shopping, now it's just an old man boring you to death with his ramblings. Likewise, when any sort of depth or detail is also absent. For every entry that features some of those great in-the-trenches details, there'll be 5 entries that don't take advantage of his position and insight and so are no better than a typical making-of book when, more often than not, he's just recounting a surface-level, bullet-point overview of events, which is super disappointing when he's recounting the making of the movie that way, but absolutely insufferable when it's just about his own life and it becomes woke up at 6, went here, saw this person, took the car in for a repair, did an interview with so-and-so, met up with Roger Corman, had a cigar, talked about maybe doing a new movie together. That not only lacks any sort of detail, but even any potential enjoyment. So even if you're a huge David Carradine fan or just interested in actors' lifestyles in general, it's not exactly illuminating. Again, he just seems to have no understanding that none of this could possibly be of interest to anyone or worth recording. On the back of the book, the blurb claims this is part autobiography, which was almost enough to make me want to put it back, because many a time we've seen actors desperately milking their involvement in a hit movie as an excuse to write a book about themselves. Interestingly, however, this is not an autobiography at all. I was surprised and appreciative of the book's scope remaining so focused on the time period of his involvement with the movie, if not always remaining focused on the movie itself, however. So it seems weird they tout it as being part autobiography since you're lying to the people who do want that and scaring away the people who don't. He actually published his autobiography 10 years before this, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, because maybe it means he got it out of his system and didn't feel the need to subject everyone to his backstory here, or if maybe it was bad because it gave him a taste for writing about his favorite subject, himself. Because although this isn't technically an autobiography, it is just as self-indulgent. The thing that truly defines this book as being almost unbearable rather than just boring is that I have never in my life witnessed someone so grossly and blatantly narcissistic. This book is just a shameless ego trip. In addition to all the praise he gives himself, he also constantly recounts praise given to him by other people. Let me tell you about someone else talking about how awesome I am. He's a complete pretentious and affected show-off to the point that it's actually pathetic how desperate he is to impress upon you how cool he is and how awesome his life is. Even several times referring to himself as a legend and an icon. If you have to tell people you're an icon, you're probably not that iconic. Obviously he's an actor, but I've never read anything this truly weird. That someone could be this self-obsessed isn't surprising, but rather the lack of humility and self-awareness of how does this sound to other people, what sort of impression am I giving with this repulsive public autofellatio? I mean, I don't think he's aware of how he even portrays himself as a bratty pain in the ass to work with either. Though if nothing else, that does at least lend evidence to the openness and honesty I valued throughout. For fans of Kill Bill who are just here to learn some behind-the-scenes stuff about the movie, there is a good amount of that in here that you're not going to get anywhere else. The problem is that, for all the great reasons I've mentioned, this book isn't like other making-of books. The sad similarity it has to most of them is how you have to slog through a frustrating amount of crap to get to the valuable parts. So there is great info in here, just not proportional to the word count, and certainly not what would be ideal for the movie. It is mind-boggling that someone could think the majority of this book is in any way worth recording, wasting paper and people's time. If you removed all that and just kept the good stuff, this book would be about 50 pages. As I said, I really liked how it gives a rare look at the entire process of an actor's involvement with a project, but only as a light overview, lacking the depth and explanations you might hope for. Plus, any of that genuinely interesting, insightful, or enjoyable content doesn't feel like it's here by intelligent design, but rather a happy byproduct of the overall shallow, bland descriptions just happening to be of interest to people unfamiliar with that insider perspective. It's clearly not a praiseworthy, conscious decision to expose readers to that rarely touched on stuff, and there's a reason it's rarely touched on, because most authors and filmmakers probably think there are more important things to discuss than the banalities. So the insight and enjoyment rests solely on that novelty and insider perspective, but that's not what should be doing the heavy lifting for the book. Without more substantial, engaging content, it wears thin and collapses, which is what happens here. When you start reading the book, it feels good, but gets worse and more tiresome, and it all steadily declines the whole way through. The concept of this book is amazing and does display some awesome ideas and potential, but the execution is too clueless to make something great of it. The content doesn't know how to live up to that. He wasted an opportunity to focus solely on the interesting parts of the movie by instead focusing on uninteresting parts of himself. And you could say, well, maybe it's just a personal diary he originally wrote for himself, but that doesn't hold up because, first of all, why would you publish something like that anyway? But more importantly, two, several times he addresses the reader directly, so obviously knew he was writing for an audience, and so should have been going to more effort for their sake to reveal and explain more stuff about the creation of the movie, chronicling it a little more than just his personal experiences, or at least have it be more interesting than just his musings and to-do lists. But the reality is, David Carradine clearly has no understanding or concern with writing anything that would be of interest to anyone other than David Carradine's biggest fan, David Carradine. Any joy and insight it does offer the reader is just incidental overlap. As for further reading, I mentioned David Carradine does have an autobiography from the 90s, so nothing about Kill Bill. Most books about Tarantino published after that time will no doubt include some info about the movie. The only other books specifically about Kill Bill are the 2 volumes of Kill Bill, an unofficial casebook, which I'm skeptical about to the point that I've never risked picking it up, so I can't tell you anything about it, but perhaps you're braver than me and that's something worth being aware of at least. One thing I highly recommend reading if you haven't already is the early draft of the Kill Bill script. It's so good and different enough to be worth reading in its own right. You can find it online. For some strange reason, I think that's actually the only Tarantino script that hasn't been published in book form.